So in this module, we'll be exploring the UI, the various output and rendering tabs, and all the tools you need for use in production. You're going to be using some of these tools way more than others, but it never hurts to know what's available. So before we get started, you might be wondering, what is the movie render queue and why is it a big deal? Why do I want to use this over the legacy sequencer renderer? What's the hype? So to quote the official documentation, the movie render queue is a successor to the sequencer render movie feature, and it is built for higher quality, easier integration into production pipelines, and user extensibility. With the movie render queue, you can accumulate multiple render samples together to produce the final output frame, which allows for much higher quality anti-aliasing, radial motion blur, and reduced noise in ray tracing. The movie render queue also supports several other new features to produce high-quality renders, such as the new high-resolution setting that allows tiled renders to overcome GPU limits and device timeout limitations. You can also export translucent images, produce 16-bit HDR images with linear data, and save render configurations into assets that you can reuse and share between developers. And what's really exciting as well is batches are now rendered with a new movie render queue, which allows you to batch render multiple sequences easily, similar to the rendering process in Adobe After Effects. So after having enabled the plugin for the movie render queue, how do we access it? So for starters, we're going to need to create a sequence. So if you're familiar with the sequencer, if you've used it before, you'll feel right at home. The movie render queue is more of a complement to the sequencer itself. They both work together. One does not replace the other. So by going to the Cinematics tab up top here, click on this and add level sequence. A window will pop up asking you where you want to save it. So I'm going to right click, create a new folder called Sequences. In this folder, I will save my sequences. So I'm going to name this sequence_001. And now, in theory, you should have a new sequencer pop up. You might have the sequencer window show up here if it is the first time you use it. I'm just going to click and hold and drag this at the bottom here just to get it out of the way and have easier access to it. And now, as of Unreal 4.27, you can now click on this button right here and it will open up the movie render queue right here. But if you're using 4.26 or earlier, you're going to have to go to Window, Cinematics, Movie Render Queue. So opening the movie render queue with the bottom button right here is a new 4.27 feature. So now you'll see you have your sequence added right here. If you don't have a sequence or you don't see anything here, you might have to go ahead and click on the big render button here and add your sequence manually. So if you've done everything correctly, you should have the name of your sequence right here. You should have unsaved config and your output. So the output is where your renders and your images are saved when you hit the render button. So in order to access all the movie render queue settings, we're going to click on the unsaved config button right here. And this will open up all your render settings. And this is where the movie render queue gets a little bit more complex. This is where you can access all the render settings you need, and also where you can save these as presets. But we're going to get into that later. So for starters, let's go ahead and explore what settings are available. So by clicking on the big green setting button up top here, you'll see we have a lot of settings here. Now the way that the movie render queue works is you have a series of tabs here that you can add or remove. So for example, I can click on JPEG sequence 8-bit, hit the delete button, and remove it from the list. By clicking on setting here, I can go ahead and add it again right here by clicking on it. Now you'll see that JPEG has been added to the list again. But pay attention, when I click on the setting button here, JPEG is no longer on the list here. So once you've added it to your tabs here, it will no longer show up in your settings list. Essentially, this prevents you from adding the same thing twice. So let's explore the first section here, settings up top. So first off, we have anti-aliasing, which is where we're going to control all our subsampling, our anti-aliasing type, our spatial and temporal samples. We're going to get into the very specifics of anti-aliasing in a later module. Next up, we have burn-in, which is essentially a way to watermark your frames with shot data such as focal length, the frame number, so on and so forth. Next up, we have the camera setting, where we can choose the shutter timing. This is a pretty advanced topic, so for the most part, in 90% of cases, you can leave it at frame center. Next, we have overscan percentage, which is essentially going to render a percentage of extra pixels along the outside of your frame. And this, again, is pretty advanced and is usually for visual effects artists who will need to apply lens distortion, and because of this, they're going to need the overscan. Again, for the most part, you can leave this at 0 unless you really know what you're doing. Next up, we have color output, and this is where we control the open color I/O settings. This is where we can disable the tone curve. We're going to get into the advanced specifics of this in a later module. Next, we have the console variables tab, which is where we're going to go manually add any console variables that we may want to enable during our renders. This can include ray tracing settings, screen percentage, so on and so forth. Later in this course, we'll be looking at a few console variables that you can use to maximize the quality of your renders. Next, we have debug options and game overrides. For the most part, this is more advanced stuff. We're going to be leaving these at default settings, unless, of course, you really know what you're doing. And the last setting here is the high resolution feature. And the high resolution setting is one of Movie Render Queue's most exciting features. This enables you to use what we call tiled renders to produce larger images that would normally be possible due to maximum texture sizes or memory limits on graphics cards. Under high resolution, the easiest way to explain this is it's going to essentially split your render into 4 tiles or more, and render each one of those tiles at a smaller resolution to create one final, extremely high resolution image for you. So for those of you with lower end graphics cards who want to render in 4K or 8K, the high resolution feature is how you can do that. So with an understanding of the tools available in the Movie Render Queue, let's carry on with the file formats available.